I've got a problem with the writing out there. I have in mind movies, specifically remakes and adaptations. It isn't that the movies themselves are bad. Very frequently, they're good. Sometimes they're great. Sometimes they're great in spite of how difficult an adaptation really is. And this could be, I mean, I say books, but I could mean comic books for all it matters. And a lot of movies actually get away with being remakes or adaptations without the bulk of the audience knowing it. And that just makes for, that means they've done their job. But I don't like that they are now so visible. I don't like that these movies are, it's like almost a default. So, first, from one side of things, I think that they are capitalizing on the the nostalgia trend. Basically, what you have a bunch of ill-parented children that grew up, and they are highly vulnerable to fits of nostalgia of all of the things that they appreciated when they were children that now they've got the budget for. So they'll go and they'll see a movie that has to do with this other thing that they liked when they were a kid, or it was a remake of a classic in their mind, or it's like a part X of a series that fizzled out way back when and it's being rebooted now. It's it goes on like that. And I I value, I respect the fact that there is an economy to take advantage of. I I do understand where there's money to be had, that's where things will go. Whether or not I would do that, who knows? But in terms of, from the perspective of let's say the writing itself, I don't like that newer media is more flooded by, let's call, it's not even dusting off old material. It's it's just reusing this stuff. It's dragging a net through swamp. It's there's something wrong about it. And I've been thinking about it for a while, this idea, my issue with adaptations. And on in one sense it's borrowing from past efforts. So for example, one thing that comes to mind is the brothers Grimm travel through Europe collecting stories and amassed a mishmash and kind of assembled a bunch of stuff and then released a set of fairy tales that we will identify with. That's part of our culture now. So things like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Cinderella and Pinocchio and stuff like that all have a kind of a heritage that gets picked up and adapted in today's, well, in the recent culture. So Disney has done quite a lot of adaptations of those old stories, and there's quite a lot of movies that were inspired by or are directly adapting from novels into the screen. So, like for example, Wizard of Oz. A lot of people will just go back to the originally black and white movie, which was a failure in the office box, but it got a cult following, and a lot of people don't know that that's from a book. So there are ways of there. I appreciate that there are successes without a work being needing to admit where it came from. But when I catch these this theft of culture, when I feel like it's dishonest for somebody to create a thing and it borrowing directly from something else, for it to be reimagined in today's culture and language, That I like. That I like a lot. A great example is Romeo and Juliet. Um, there's there have been quite a number of interesting remakes, some of which that don't actually use the title. That and they're very, very good. But there's something that's deceptive or dishonest, or it just feels like a cheat when a new show, a new movie, a new game, a new anything comes out and it's just like that, only with a new coat of paint. And I've always had this sense of noticing when this is happening. And I think it's become more and more of a thing where what we see is just based on something else. And I was thinking about it today that this is very much like a version of in the higher education. There's a concept, I've been told it is called intellectual incest. And this is when a university, for example, hires its own alumni. It hires its graduates to become professors. And there's something diluting about that. There's something that's shrinking when you teach the next generation and the next generation, and then it cycles into itself. It's like pulling back from the world. Instead of hiring outsiders, you're hiring the same and the same and the same, and you get less and less of the variety out there. And in the case of any group, like a university, when they do that, when they cycle through that, what ends up happening is they end up, it's not, sometimes it is they directly have barriers because it's, I know what's right? I taught what's good and right and true in the world, and their ethics, their morality, their everything kind of makes them other, the outsiders. And so things become more and more insular. And it's kind of like withdrawing from international travel to be nationalistic, withdrawing from that to be just your town, withdrawing to be just your house, to be just your bedroom, to be just your closet, and putting up little balls of cotton on the walls until everything is nice and safe and padded and you don't have to pay attention to anything else out there. It's not intentional like that. For example, in the university example, it's just they no longer know how to listen. So the individuals that are in charge, that are teaching, only have the perspective given to them and not the perspective from having a real life experience from the outside world. That becomes dampened. It's still there, obviously, but there's something that's retracting. And the difficulty with that is in withdrawing from it ends up becoming antagonistic, that outside world, because somebody that's so withdrawn ends up becoming more and more impacted when the real world does happen upon them. It's antagonistic to open up those doors. So, for example, a professor who was a student who got their degree and then just became a professor, they don't have any concept of actually using those skills in the outside world and having to compete and act in the world with those skills and then come back and become a professor. They're just maybe a more capable version of an audio book of their textbooks. They're not useful. And I feel like movies are something like this as well. I feel like the reuse of old stuff, even if it's being reimagined in today's culture for today's audience with today's techniques, I feel that there's something culturally incestuous about that, where there's just it really is possible for there to be entirely newly imagined universes that can be adapted to film. It's not hard to just reach out anywhere and find a new author, a new book, a new anything. And it's not hard to, I mean, it's hard, but in terms of availability, it is still perfectly reasonable to take a brand new, untested universe from the mind of a creator and to adapt it, to make a screenplay out of it, to turn it into a movie. It is still viable to do that without needing to go and borrow from existing nostalgia. And I think that the movie industry specifically sees too much advantage in capitalizing on nostalgia and too much risk in the untested waters of a new universe. And that's going to bite them hard, because nostalgia is now, I mean, I gave up on nostalgia a long time ago. As soon as a person's hit by too many, oh, this is another video game adaptation movie, or this is another comic book movie, and now movies are capitalizing on the nostalgia of other movies in their same universe. Like comic book movies these days are just, oh, this is just like that 2002 movie that same group also put out. Again, they're being incestuous about stealing from their own past. They're taking all that material and they're just using it again. And some movies they've rebooted the same thing. How many times has Batman been rebooted? I mean, do we want to talk about The Incredible Hulk? And I think with there being such a bulk of literature out there, that it is still possible, no matter how intimidating it is, to take something that's original, that we still have the expertise, and there's still some courage out there to take all of that and actually turn it into new material, never before seen in any form other than that original book. And I think it's possible for something completely original to be created just to become a movie. It doesn't need to have a background as a book. It doesn't need to be already tested. And that there's a problem of understanding and a problem of probably investor intimidation, where an investor will see that a book did well and will say, okay, if the book did well, then a good movie adaptation done by other people who have done similar things, and those things did well, book does well, they do well, they work on thing, that makes movie that does well. Except we've noticed that doesn't actually happen in reality. We've noticed that the audiences are getting jaded. We've noticed that some stuff is just bombed. We've noticed that there's more complexity in bringing something out than just capitalizing on nostalgia, than just capitalizing on existing successes of previous works, of just rebooting, of that a franchise doesn't need to continue from earlier editions of a franchise, that we don't actually have to create franchises. We now have an audience that's getting more and more social and more personally aware of, well, they're, let's say, more realistic and harsher about judging things. And now that movies are more than just the thing. Movies are now capitalizing on the nostalgia of specific actors in the movie. So that movie has this actor who I really loved in this other thing. And that's star power for a movie. And that draws from a whole bunch of other stuff to put them in the one movie. And the fact that that's happening more and more, and the fact that that's recognized, means that a lot of these movies, they they are complex. They are not built just on the hope of the remake that they are, the original content that they are borrowing from. I know things are a lot more complicated, but something in me says that it's still dishonest to steal from the past. That sometimes the stuff that's in the past should just stay in the past. Sometimes it doesn't need to be revisited to have a current. Like things in the past were different and had a different context, and sometimes bringing it into the present either makes that environment of the past of that movie, its success, seem really awkward and sometimes wrong, sometimes immoral. And it's not really necessary to dust something off from the past to update it to today's culture. That we don't need to go back and revisit The Wizard of Oz because we don't like the fact that there were people of a certain appearance who sang a certain song in a certain way. Like we can just make something new for today and just let that be part of film history or what have you, and have that be part of people's childhood and let them grow up and out of that and have them appreciate that. We don't need to remake it once every 10 years. And we don't need to remake it and edit it once every 10 years and make the statement that, oh, that we don't need that other stuff. We have something brand new, and pretend like the other stuff doesn't exist. I think that the production of a material should be, in a sense, locked in a time capsule and then left there. And if it is to be continued, it's to be continued by its original creators. Author dies, it ends. It just ends. I don't like that the inheritors of intellectual property will try to build upon that nostalgia. And there have been great authors who have died and their work has been handed over to their family, for example, and their family's like, oh, I found some old notes, dust it all off, compile it into a really bad book, release it, same last name, and do it for the money. And again, I can respect that there's money in that, but it just feels wrong. Same thing with movies. It just feels wrong that you're borrowing on the cartoons of Disney from way back in the day. It feels wrong that you're remaking this show that was made for selling toys. It feels wrong that there's a third generation reboot of the same cartoon series. It just feels unoriginal and boring. It feels upsetting. I mean, it does feel like my childhood is being mined for the last tiny little dusting of gold that might remain there. Like I lived through it. I got to appreciate the original of such and such. Now I see a remake, and it maybe it's good, but then it gets remade again. Maybe it's not good. I have to think, oh well, I like the original, and I just want something brand new every time. Yeah, that's it.